Hi, everybody. We're going to go on a bit of a journey today, so I hope you brought your coffee. 3/4 of the time, we'll be exploring up to the second science on the nature of reality and consciousness itself, and the last quarter will be clinical application of these new insights. Mankind's understanding of the universe and everything in it, including ourselves, has over time been shaped by our limited perceptual capacity. Our understanding of the world has evolved from caveman times through the Middle Ages to modern times as technology has shaped our worldview with ever more powerful telescopes, microscopes, and other apparatus facilitating the evolution of our thought and understanding. Ours is the first generation that's been able to explore down to the very fabric of the nature of reality itself, allowing us to gain a level of understanding that has totally reset our conception of how things work. These new insights have very real and practical applications for patients in the psychology field and to ourselves. By the way, in many ways, this presentation is an experiential intervention, as you'll see by the end. Over the years, as I attended AA meetings, I developed the belief that those with any sense of spiritual devoutness seem to have an easier time establishing and maintaining long-term recovery than those with atheistic or agnostic perspectives. As a clinician, I thought it might be useful to try and hack into whatever was behind this phenomenon so that my patients might derive the clinical benefits of spirituality, and in the process found myself having to account for the concept of consciousness, as it appears to be an integral part of the communication loop between those with a belief in a higher power and their higher power. I approached the spirituality problem from the angle of placebo effect, which can account for as much as 75% efficacy in medical studies. And in talk therapy, I'm not trying to fix anyone's physiological symptoms, I'm just trying to help them change their mind a bit. My study of placebo effect and spirituality ultimately led me down a 2-year-long rabbit hole delving into the very nature of consciousness itself, something about which I was previously quite skeptical because there's been so little scientific data substantiating its nature. If anything, there was only circumstantial evidence. Explaining consciousness was like trying to explain the essential nature of wind to someone. You can see the effects of the wind, but without modern scientific tools and understanding, it would be impossible to explain to someone what wind is. We've all heard the saying, I've never met anyone too stupid to get sober, but I've met plenty who are too smart to get sober. In other words, analytical people tend to be the least suggestible when it comes to adoption of perspectives that takes the idea of anything that they can't see, such as consciousness, seriously. They do, however, respect credible facts from credible people. Thankfully, the most successful model of the nature of reality, which is what physics is, the study of the nature of reality, the most successful model has significant implications that leave little room for doubt as to the existence of what we call consciousness, and that it plays a major role in cognitive restructuring or neuroplasticity, and thus behavioral change. Over the last 7 years, I've formalized and implemented with many patients in varied settings, ranging from residential treatment to IOP to individual therapy and workshops, a clinical model aimed at accelerating both the rate and depth of patients' recovery to a remarkable effect, utilizing the mechanics between consciousness and material reality, literally employing mind over matter, in this case, the gray matter that lies between the ears of our patients. Application of the clinical model I developed involves 3 elements. First, a cursory understanding of the science behind reality itself. Second, extraction of relevant data from that science for use in cognitive restructuring. And third, the clinical expertise to apply the material in an evidence-based manner, the latter of which you already possess. So really, this entire model is evidence-based in that peer-reviewed research studies support both the science and the delivery of the extrapolated content. It's just because the model itself is so new and the psychology community so dogmatic in its approach to new recovery models, it has yet to become mainstream and may not within my lifetime. To give you an example, I published a book in 2021 outlining this model and its components, and the AA bookstore in the market in which I was living at the time wouldn't carry it because it wasn't Hazelden approved. It didn't appear in their catalog, and so for all practical purposes, it didn't exist in their mind. It's lonely at the cutting edge of any field, and ours is no exception. Nonetheless, until developing this clinical model, my preferred modality in dealing with patients was REBT, Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, because I believed, and still do, that patients will have more buy-in if they have a rational understanding of their pathology, the approach that we're taking, and why we're taking it. Of course, the addition of the new quantum scientific knowledge to the mix necessitated the addition of a Q to the REBT abbreviation, but I switched the REBT around because Q-REBT doesn't sound quite as cool as Qbert. But for the sake of simplicity, the generic name for this innovative model is now biofield therapy, which we'll use moving forward. By the way, the behavioral element of Qbert involves intensive mental rehearsal or meditation with emotional visualization, the purpose of which will be revealed in a few slides. But this is the doing part of biofield therapy, a part of what I call the magic wand thought experiment, which creates a compelling vision for patients to move toward, and which serves a number of clinical purposes, some obvious and some less so. As previously mentioned, it can be helpful for both we and our patients to understand why we would utilize a biofield change model to help them overcome their pathology, whether mental health or addiction. An REBT-type clinical approach requires that both client and therapist be on the same page in terms of how the patient got the way they did and the path to recovery. There are very few instances when the approach I'm about to outline has failed to elicit buy-in from my clients, which is essential in facilitating their recovery by accessing their internal motivation. And also, it's useful in improving their capacity to develop the metacognitive ability necessary for them to implement change, both between sessions and beyond the therapeutic episode. The ability for them to think about what they're thinking about, if you will. This fundamental understanding streamlines the recovery process as the patient develops and internalizes this 20,000-foot view of both their pathology and the goal or end game. I explain it like this, starting from the bottom up. Number one, regardless of their belief system leading up to the therapeutic episode, I introduced the idea of a spiritual self. Initially, belief along these lines isn't necessary, but psychoeducation on quantum physics, which we'll be going over shortly in detail, helps to resolve any doubts along these lines. If they already have a sense of spirituality, this helps to streamline our conversation and reinforces those beliefs by providing a scientific basis to help them make sense of their spiritual experiences to date. Number two, from there, we move fairly quickly to that which all of us can agree upon, that we are born into material form and into our most authentic state of being, at least on this plane of existence. It's here that I introduce the principle of authenticity, as discussed by Dr. Gabor Mate in any number of lectures available on YouTube. Number three, in them, Mate points out that we're not born into a vacuum, but rather a social context defined by our caregivers, a family of origin which may or may not have had significant dysfunction, including experiences outlined in the famed Adverse Childhood Experiences longitudinal study that we're all familiar with from grad school. Gabor Mate suggests that this dysfunctional environment, and I can't really imagine what a perfectly healthy family environment would look like, but anyway, this is the point where a child learns to repress aspects of its true self in order to maintain attachment with its parents. After all, the human infant is by far the most vulnerable for the longest period of time of any creature on the planet. And so The child instinctively knows that if it is rejected by its parents, it may be abandoned, and if it's abandoned, it will literally die. As such, as a survival mechanism, in order to maintain attachment to its parents, it adapts. Pure adaptation. By repressing its true self, or aspects of it, in favor of attachment. Gabor Mate would say that this repressive adaptation is at odds with its other evolutionary need, which is for authenticity, the autonomy necessary to fully realize its potential out in the real world beyond the family home. Mate states that it's this discrepancy between the need for authenticity on one hand and the need for attachment on the other that is at the root of all emotional pathology moving forward. The byproduct of inauthenticity in favor of attachment is always resentment toward self and others, self-directed anger, shame, and consequent low self-esteem, which, if not intervened upon, then sets the stage for a lifetime of dysfunctional relationships, mental health issues, and generational dysfunction. Mental health issues such as anxiety, the feeling of walking on eggshells around those that the patient is fearful of losing, in other words, fear of abandonment, depression, and personality traits such as people-pleasing, then infect relational dynamics between the patient and all future adult relationships beyond the family of origin, as the patient unconsciously seeks relationships with people who feel familiar to them, thus perpetuating their pathology unless intervened upon. And finally, many of the people that have mental health issues adopt addictions to self-medicate the mental health pathology that developed as a survival mechanism to deal with their dysfunctional family of origins. And after enough pain, they eventually present to us as their best thinking ultimately proved inadequate to resolve their relational problems. So our job as clinicians then is to help patients work back down through those layers of pathology to help them find and occupy a state that their authentic selves would have become had the dysfunction of the world, including their family of origin, not gotten a hold of them. A fully realized, authentic, unapologetic version of their true self. That's the end game. Now, the opposite of addiction isn't abstinence. The opposite of addiction is the ability to be able to engage in healthy relationships with healthy people, because it's only within the context of healthy relationships that we can experience true love, which happens to be the most fulfilling experience we can have on this plane of existence. The end game then is to become a safe person to love. Addiction undermines everything that makes a person a safe person to love. A safe person to love, for instance, is not a chameleon. They're not a moving target. They're trustworthy. They're honest. They're transparent. They honestly believe that they are worthy of love. They're self-aware. They're emotionally intelligent and consistent. This is the state of authenticity that we hope to recover. So when we talk about recovery, what we're recovering is our true self. As I'm going through this conversation with patients, I can usually see the light bulbs going on as they replay their lives against this backdrop in their heads, reaffirming the things I've laid out for them thus far. This is a recurring theme throughout the treatment episode, and it becomes internalized, hopefully. Initially, there are often conflicting senses of relief and anger as patients realize the good news that if the problem is so clearly defined, then the solutions will likely be equally clear. But also the bad news that in light of the simplicity of this model of pathology, they kind of wish they'd figured it out sooner, potentially leading to a different life than they have experienced to date. And of course, the older they are, the more difficulty they have handling this reality. But this combination of hope and anger, however, tend to motivate the client toward more fully engaging in the recovery process. And this is when they usually ask, how? Activating the action stage of change that we're familiar with in Prochaska and De Clementi's model. I like to give them an overview of what the change process looks like, but also from another perspective. So I usually show the patients this video to offer them a perspective of both what stagnation and change look like, which is eminently applicable to addiction and the recovery process. This is an excerpt from a lecture by Dr. Joe Dispenza to a group of entrepreneurs in Mexico City, remarkably applicable to our patients. As patients are watching it, though, I ask that they relate the content to their own lives and how it applies to their addictions. So let's have a look.
How many people believe in the idea that the way you think has some effect on your life? That your thoughts are intimately connected to your future? So your thoughts in some way create your reality. You believe that? So how many people in this audience have a clear vision of their future? You see, you think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that you think in one day, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So if you believe that your thoughts somehow are connected to your life, then the same thoughts always lead to the same choices. The same choices always lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors create the same experiences, and the same experiences produce the same emotions. And those very same emotions drive the very same thoughts. And your biology, your neurocircuitry, your neurochemistry, your neurohormones, and even your genetic expression is equal to how you think, how you act, and how you feel. And how you think, how you act, and how you feel is called your personality. And your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. So then, if you wanted to create a new personal reality, a new life, then you would have to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. You would have to become aware of your unconscious thoughts and observe them. You would have to pay attention to your automatic habits and behaviors and modify them. And you would have to look at the emotions you live by every single day that are connected to your past and decide if those emotions belong in your future. You see, most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. You literally have to become someone else. So your brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of the past. It's an artifact of all the things you've learned and experienced to this moment. So if you wake up every morning and get out of bed on the same side, shut the alarm clock off with the same finger, shuffle into the bathroom and use the toilet like you always do, go and get a cup of coffee and drink coffee out of your favorite mug, then get in the shower and wash yourself off in the same routine way, drive to work, get to work, see the same people that push the same emotional buttons, do the same things that you've memorized and do so well, then hurry up and go home, and hurry up and check your emails, and hurry up and check your Facebook, then hurry up and go to bed. Here's my question. Did your brain change at all that day? We could say that you were thinking the same thoughts, performing the same unconscious actions, living by the same emotions, but secretly expecting your life to change. So there's a principle in neuroscience. And the principle says, nerve cells that fire together wire together. So if you're thinking the same thoughts, making the same choices, demonstrating the same behaviors, reproducing the same experiences that stamp the same networks of neurons into the same patterns, and then produce the same emotions, you're going to hardwire your brain into a very finite signature. Because as you fire and wire the same circuits in the same way, those circuits begin to become more connected. And by the time you're 35 years old, this is science now, we become a set of memorized behaviors, unconscious habits, automatic emotional reactions, beliefs and perceptions, and even attitudes that function just like a computer program. And if you do something over and over and over again, the repetition of those actions over time conditions your body to know how to do it well, better than your mind. And a habit is when your body knows better than your mind, where you've done something so many times that the body now knows how to do it better than the brain. And so 95% of most people's behaviors, attitudes, thoughts, beliefs, emotional reactions are subconscious programs. So why is that important? Because you're here this week to learn new information. And every time you learn something new, you make new connections in your brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new synaptic connections. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment and the footprints of consciousness is called learning, making new connections. And the Nobel Prize laureate Kandel in the year 2000 found that when people learned one bit of information, they doubled the number of connections in their brain from 1,300 connections to 2,600 connections. But if they didn't review that information, if they couldn't repeat it, if they couldn't remember it, those circuits pruned apart in hours or days. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. And you are here this week to learn vital information about creating a future and be defined by a vision of the future instead of the memories of the past. Because if you are not defined by some vision that is bigger than you, and you are not passionate about that vision, then you're left with the old hardware of the past in your brain, and you will be predictable in your life. So would you agree then? New thoughts, new information should lead to new choices. New choices should lead to new behaviors. And new behaviors should create new experiences. And new experiences should produce new emotions. And those new emotions should drive new thoughts. And that's called evolution. So if your brain is a record of the past, and you don't have a vision of the future, then you are living in the past. And you will never arrive at that new future. So then if you wake up in the morning and you are not being defined by a vision that's bigger than you, and it doesn't get you out of bed and inspire you into possibility, and you get up living from the old hardware of the past and the old emotions stored in your body, do you know what's going to happen to you? You're going to wake up and you're going to open your eyes and you're going to see the same people and go to the same places and do the exact same thing at the exact same time. And the moment you open your eyes, all of a sudden now, it's your external environment that's controlling how you think and feel. Because you have a neurological network in your brain for every person you know, every place that you go, everything that you own, everything that you do. And the moment you open your eyes and you see the same people and go to the same places and do the exact same thing at the exact same time, it's your external environment that's turning on different circuits in your brain, causing you to think equal to everything that you know. And you told me you believe that your thoughts have something to do with your destiny. And as long as you're thinking equal to your environment, you keep creating the same life. To change, to truly change, is to think greater than your environment, to think greater than the circumstances in your life, to think greater than the conditions in your world. And every great person in history knew this. Whether it was Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the Wright brothers, Joan of Arc, they all had a vision. Couldn't see it, couldn't smell it, couldn't taste it, couldn't feel it, but it was alive in their mind. It was so alive in their mind that they began to live as if that future reality was happening in the present moment. And so the moment you stop making the same choices that you always make, get ready, because it's going to be uncomfortable. And that's the moment you are heading towards the new self. And we call it stepping into the river of change. But now, remember, 95% of who you are is your body as the mind. You know, you've done something enough times that your body does it better than your brain. So you may actually complain unconsciously because your body does it all the time. And all of a sudden you say, no complaining, no more blaming, no more feeling sorry for myself, no more talking about other people. I'm going to stop. You know what happens, don't you? The body starts sending signals to the brain. The body's been conditioned that way. And all of a sudden, you start hearing the thoughts in your head that say, why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. This is too hard for me. I can't change. Something's wrong with me. It's my mother's fault. It's my ex-husband's fault. It's my ex-wife's fault. I'm this way because of this event. Or the most important one, this doesn't feel right. And the moment you respond to that thought as if it's true, that thought leads to the same choice, which leads to the same behavior, that creates the same experience, that produces the same emotion, and the person says, this feels right. That feels familiar. Going from the old self to the new self, stepping into that void, stepping into that uncertainty, is the biological, the neurological, the chemical, the hormonal, genetic death of the old self. And people will say to us, well, in that unknown, I can't predict my life or my future. And we always say the same thing to them. The best way to predict your future is to create it, not from the known, but from the unknown. And when you and I get comfortable in the place of the unknown, that's where the magic happens. And it never happens in the known.
Joe Dispenza's change model explains how clients will go about regaining their authenticity, undoing decades of dysfunctional emotional conditioning and its symptomatic behaviors. So let's have a look. Again, for the average person, 95% of the thoughts that they have today are the same thoughts they had yesterday. They show up to our office with everything they know from their past, their experiences, their unquestioned belief about who they are, about their limitations, past failed efforts to change, conditioning from their dysfunctional family of origin, and their beliefs about the world. Those thoughts have perpetuated the same choices, yielding the same behaviors, experiences, and emotions, which then reinformed their thoughts, and the circle repeated itself until they realized that the status quo was unsustainable, and they reached out to us. We then provide new information in the form of recovery content, literature, videos, TED Talks. We point out blind spots in their thinking, and we also introduce them to experiential interventions such as individual therapy, AA, groups, etc. As a result, their thoughts change, and they begin to incrementally make new choices, resulting in new behaviors, yielding new experiences that generate new emotions, which reinforces their desire to seek more new information. And over time, the client's life incrementally improves until, I guess, what we would call the maintenance phase, where continued exposure to recovery information reinforces the positive changes in their lives, ultimately creating a new healthy status quo. It's my belief that information and the resultant experiences are probably the most important aspects of this change model, but we'll touch more on that later. So let's put on our science hats as we explore the nature of consciousness and then apply that knowledge clinically. Understanding and application of one core aspect of quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, helps to resolve one of the most common, pervasive, and destructive beliefs infecting our patients, which is victim mentality, or the false belief that their state and consequent behaviors are dictated by environmental factors, people, environment, circumstances, events, etc. In a word, blaming. Speaking of blaming, I guess it's hard to blame our patients for blaming their environment for their state and their choices when everything they learned in school about the nature of reality reinforces this sort of Newtonian cause and effect way of thinking, which is informed by particle theory, which was the basis of our understanding throughout the last century. Conventional wisdom throughout modern history is that at our most fundamental level, we're made up of tiny marbles, atoms, subatomic particles, and nothing more. This premise creates the false impression that everything merely bounces off of everything else, and the model also implies that any sort of change requires significant overt time, effort, and is largely out of control as we bounce off of our environment, which is far larger and more influential than we are. But a cursory understanding of some elemental aspects of quantum physics does help to undermine this dogmatic view that's so prevalent in our patients' belief system. One dimension of quantum mechanics, which we'll explore momentarily, quantum field theory, although it's no longer a theory but the most successful model of reality that we do have to date. It shows that we are not, in fact, victims of our circumstances, but rather that we create our circumstances, and this exposes the mechanism behind how that works. When clients can no longer blame their circumstances on anything but themselves, their habitual thought patterns, and so on, this forces a fundamental shift in their mindset toward recovery, toward their past, including shame and regret, and their prospects for the future. Hopefully toward spirituality, the clinical benefits thereof being fundamental to a strong recovery. Now, remember when you were taught in school that the three fundamental particles in an atom are a proton, a neutron, and an electron. Well, the reality is that protons and neutrons are each comprised of three smaller particles, quarks, which come in two varieties, up quarks and down quarks. I guess by the 70s, physicists ran out of fancy names for their subatomic particles, so there you go. Anyway, a proton contains two up quarks and a down quark, and a neutron consists of two down quarks and an up quark. The electrons of an atom orbit the nucleus, as seen here, but the important thing to understand here, however, is that an atom truly only consists of three fundamental particles that you see on the right: up quarks, down quarks, and electrons. It's astounding if you take a moment to think about that. Everything in the universe, everything, you, me, your chair, your patients, the air, the sun, everything in the universe are just slightly differing arrangements of only these three fundamental particles. As noted in the previous slide, every element in the periodic table consists of varying arrangements of these three fundamental particles, and everything in the universe is made up of these 100 or so elemental atoms. But in the picture on the right, you'll see how our science teachers did us a supreme disservice with a simple error in portrayal of how atoms have always been depicted, contributing to the average person's profoundly inaccurate understanding of the world. If you look at the lower right-hand portion of the illustration to the right, you can see how conveniently tight electron orbits of various types are shown in different configurations. This fundamentally inaccurate depiction has skewed our understanding of the universe and ourselves at an atomic level. In fact, you'll be astounded at how out of scale the representations we've grown up with actually are. And the implications for this simple visual error are monumental. Let's get a better idea of the real architecture of an atom.
It's mostly empty.
We were all taught in school that the world is made of stuff, of matter, of mass, of atoms. Atoms make up molecules, molecules make up materials, and everything is made of that. But atoms actually are mostly empty. For example, if this ball were the nucleus of an atom, a proton in a hydrogen atom, for example, then the electron circling this, which would describe the outer limits of that atom, would be out by that mountain over there, roughly 20 miles away. And everything in between is empty. In fact, the universe is mostly empty. However, when we go down in scale, in the emptiness, we eventually come to a level, the fundamental level of space-time geometry, the fine basement level of the universe, where there's information, there's a pattern. It's called the Planck scale, and it's the fabric of the universe. And at that level, there's information that's been there since the Big Bang.
So that's a super important fact, right? Atoms are in reality about 1/10,000,000th matter and 99.9999999% empty space. So think about that for a minute. Now, scientists have spent the last few decades studying the precise nature of all of that empty space, and the results have been astounding and profound. But let's frame this new information a few different ways. If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom were blown up to the size of a golf ball, the electron could be in a sphere anywhere within a 1.5 mile radius. If you removed all the empty space from between all the atoms comprising the concrete, glass, and steel of the IDS Tower in downtown Minneapolis, or the Empire State Building for that matter, you'd be left with something the size of a tiny grain of rice weighing millions of tons. If you removed all of the empty space from between all of the subatomic particles from all 7.5 billion people on the planet, you'd end up with a clump of matter the size of a sugar cube. In other words, you and I are barely more than holograms. Yet, modern medicine focuses only on the 1/10,000,000th of us that's actual matter, ignoring the other 99.9999999% of us that Eastern philosophy and, frankly, placebo effect seem to leverage, which is a major focus in my practice. Now let's dig down a bit more into the sub-basement level of reality, to what all that empty space is really made of, how it works, and why this is so important as it relates to consciousness, cognitive restructuring, and ultimately behavioral change. Let's start, for instance, from where these particles that we're talking about, the quarks and electrons, come from. And what's the mechanism behind their appearance and their behavior? Well, these fundamental particles are derived from what lies in all of that empty space. What we've discovered is that at the sub-basement level of reality lie 17 immaterial fields. It's the best way to put it. They're all enmeshed and interacting with each other to create what we refer to as reality, the universe, and so on. It's important to understand that these immaterial fields are continuous and unbroken throughout all of space and throughout time. They go throughout the entire universe, and they go all the way back to the Big Bang. Atoms, we, and everything in the universe are in fact derivative of these fields and how they interact with each other. So there are basically three types of fields. There's 12 scalar fields, which are the three left-hand columns there. There are 4 vector fields, which is the orange ones in the fourth column, and the Higgs field, which was finally proven to exist in 2012, just over a decade ago. So here they are and how they work. Scalar fields yield particles, quarks, electrons, etc. Now, tiny excitations or localized spikes of energy in the scalar field then interact with the Higgs field, which is the mechanism whereby the energy of those sparks is converted to matter. And once we have a particle, the vector fields then govern their behavior. For instance, the gluon fields hold the up and down quarks together into protons and neutrons. The Z boson field holds the protons and neutrons together into nuclei, and the W boson field governs the behavior of electrons, creating the atoms in the periodic table and allowing for chemistry as the outer electron shells interact with each other, creating molecules and thus everything and everyone in the universe. If it weren't for the vector fields, particles would simply just fly around willy-nilly and nothing would coalesce into anything recognizable. In other words, the universe would be a very different place if any values or aspects of this intricate system differed in the least. So it's the fields or the field system that is ultimately fundamental in the architecture of the universe. It's not particles or matter, but the fields that are fundamental. Let's have more of a three-dimensional look at how this plays out.
Where were we? To understand.
So this is a two-dimensional rendering of how the fields work. Again, we've got the up quark, down quark, and electrons on the left-hand side. There's photon fields and so on. So we get a spike of energy in the field. If it's in the electromagnetic field, that spike can turn into a photon. If it's in the electron field, an electron field is possibly made, and if there's a spike in the quark field, up or down quark, it potentially creates a spark, or a quark. So what's interesting is when there's not enough energy for the fields to interact with the Higgs field, there's no actual particle. So these fields are constantly fluctuating at a level just beneath the ability to create an actual particle with the Higgs field. It's teeming with virtual particles. And these are fleeting. They don't really come into existence. But this is important because there are very specific levels of energy required in order to interact with the Higgs field. A lot of times these virtual particles, they just don't have what it takes, if you will. This is consciousness will come in to play a little bit later in discussing virtual particles. But anyway, you've got these different fields, and when there is a sufficient level of energy, they will, in fact, interact with the Higgs field, creating an actual real particle, such as an electron or a quark. In this case, energy requires 0.511 mega electron volts per square centimeter in order to create an electron. And you have to have twice as much, no more or less, to create 2 electrons. So that's probably, we don't need to go any further than that. But again, just understand that the fundamental architecture of the universe of reality is these immaterial fields, and that the field energy is converted from energy to matter by interacting with the Higgs field, creating a particle which then is the behavior of which is governed by the vector fields. Okay, you don't have to memorize this, there's no test, but ultimately the main takeaway here is that there are 2 states that exist in the universe. One is immaterial, which these are interchangeable names, right? Immaterial fields and information, energy, waves, etc. All those things are fundamental to reality. Everything else is epiphenomena of those fields, particles, what we refer to as matter, anything that's mass or that appears solid. And remember, none of this is theory. It's proven science. It's just simply the way that things are. So where does consciousness fit in the picture? Let's try to define what consciousness is and what it is not. Consciousness is not matter, right? Therefore, it must be immaterial or energy. By the way, energy can't be destroyed. We know that. That might have implications for spirituality, right? In terms of the energy that creates our consciousness. It doesn't go away. It can't. Consciousness has a singular perceptual vantage point, at least on our material plane of existence. I think people can argue about a universal consciousness all they want, but for our purposes here and now, that's really irrelevant. Consciousness has intent. I mean, subatomic particles, quarks and electrons, for example, don't want stuff, right? They don't aspire to be pilots, therapists, to fall in love, and so on. So consciousness has intent. It also has a material impact on reality, including between our ears and beyond. In other words, it affects matter, as evidenced by placebo effect, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But consciousness does have a material impact on reality. And we're going to see proof of this in a minute. And we'll also explore it and witness the implications of this dynamic between energy and matter, which also happens to be the mechanism that makes neuroplasticity, and thus change, possible. Remember those virtual particles whose energy level was just below that which would be sufficient to interact with the Higgs field? Well, this phenomena makes it so that the application of just slightly more energy can push those virtual particles into a strong enough state where they inevitably interact with the Higgs field. So it's this that makes mind over matter a very literal expression. But how do we prove this experimentally? Well, it turns out there was a famous lab experiment done decades ago called the double slit experiment that caused scientists to actually explore the relationship between consciousness and material reality. So this experiment is what got people looking into what has turned out to be called quantum field theory. Let's have a look.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never-world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Interesting, no? So it was only upon observation, right, that the application of conscious energy, if you will, that possibility or energy was forced into a state of material reality in that experiment. In other words, consciousness was a catalyst converting energy into matter. So the reason why physicists initially had trouble figuring out how their observation, or lack thereof, of the system could impact its state was because they incorrectly imagined themselves as being separate from the apparatus. In other words, they failed to understand at the time that both they and the apparatus are in fact derivative of the exact same field system. And thus the energy of their focus was sufficient to change the state of the system from wave to particle, or from possibility to reality is another way of looking at it. So measurement or observation, of course, requires an observer, and an observer has awareness or consciousness. In the absence of the observer or the additional conscious energy, if you will, no particles were formed, leaving nothing but waves or potential. When faced with this quandary, and this is duplicatable in labs anytime you want to see it, it's all over the internet. But when faced with this quandary, of course, Einstein stated, "I like to think that the moon is there when I'm not looking at it." And according to science, at least this model, which again is accurate, it's technically not there, which of course leaves room for the possibility that a greater consciousness could be keeping an eye on the things that we're not paying attention to. But perhaps that's a story for another time. Now, you might say, by the way, all this is fine and dandy when we're talking about a single subatomic particle stream in a laboratory, but the world isn't a laboratory and there are no slits in the world, which is obviously much more complex than any lab apparatus. You wouldn't be the first to have thought of that, so let's look at how this plays out in the real world.
Velocity is unknowable. But unmeasured properties are not just uncertain, they are fundamentally undefined. One of the most profound illustrations of this is the famous double-slit experiment. If you aren't familiar, check out our previous episode that discusses it in detail. You might also want to catch up on the first two in our quantum field theory playlist, because we are going to be building on that. But the too long didn't watch for the double-slit experiment is this. A particle, say a photon or an electron, travels through a barrier containing two slits to a screen. Its initial and final positions are known, but what path does it take in between? Which slit does it go through? The interference pattern produced by particles on the screen can only be explained if each of them travels through both slits, not as a particle, but as a wave that fills the intervening space, interacts with itself, and defines the probability of that particle actually showing up at a given point on the screen. There's a story about a quantum mechanics professor explaining the double-slit experiment to a class. The prof showed how the locations of the particles on the screen can be calculated by adding the amplitude of a wave passing through one slit to the amplitude of a wave passing through the other slit. One impertinent student asked, "What happens if you cut a third slit in the barrier?" The professor replied, "Obviously you have to add together the amplitudes of waves passing through all three slits." The student pushed it. "But what if you add 4 slits? What about 5? To which the agitated professor repeated, "Add the amplitudes of 4 slits, 5 slits, etc. Feeling cocky, the student asked, "What about if you cut infinite slits, so there's no more screen? And then what if you add a second screen with infinite slits?" As the probably apocryphal story goes, that student was Richard Feynman, and he just outlined the basics of what was to become the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. It was a simple idea, but it led to the most elegant formulation of quantum mechanics ever devised and became a key to quantum field theory.
So the cumulative result of the science done over the past 100 years or so is pretty remarkable. But again, in reality doesn't have slits, but it doesn't matter. The same principle applies, and remember, all the science underlying this material is repeatable and has undergone research studies with thorough peer review, ultimately culminating in the what's referred to as the standard model equation. It's an equation that defines and predicts any observable event that you can imagine. It's too bad they couldn't come up with a more interesting name for it, considering its importance, but again, we're dealing with physicists here, so. Something we haven't touched on fully is the concept of information theory. But as you can see, this equation and everything in the universe is chock full of information. In fact, information is even fundamental to the field system in that information defines its properties, the entire field system, all the different fields and how they interact. It's information that defines the laws that govern the behavior and interactions of the field system, resulting in the reality in which we all live and are derivative of. So let's touch for a minute on this idea of information. You remember the Dispenza change model discussed earlier, that new information leads to new thoughts, choices, etc. The information in the most fundamental sense of the word underlies everything, again, including the unified field system that we've been exploring thus far, and consciousness for that matter. Again, the rules by which the field system operates are defined by information, right? So I'd like to focus on the idea of information transfer for a minute. You can refer to a handout that I provided you just for fun. If it's helpful, think of yourself as the person on the right of the screen as I'm reading, and me on the left, or if you don't have a handout, just close your eyes, use your imagination, and try to follow along. It's an excerpt from chapter 11 of my first book, which was published in 2021. Here we go. There is literally no such thing as empty space. In fact, it's packed with at least 17 immaterial fields. If the universe were a painting, these fields would be the three-dimensional canvas upon which the world, everything we see and everything we don't, is painted. Exactly how pervasive are these fields? Well, consider for a moment the letters that make up the words on the pages of this book. The letters are actually made up of microscopic dots of ink molecules sprayed onto the pages of the paper that's composed of paper molecules, all of which are composed of atoms that, in turn, consist of subatomic particles. Each subatomic particle is derivative of perturbations or spikes or excitations in one of the three respective fields from which everything that we see originates: electrons, up quark, down quark. The letters, words, sentences, and ink on the pages are being perceived by your brain. Your brain is derivative of the same subatomic particles and thus field perturbations, as is the content and media comprising this book. The neurons that synthesize the ideas contained herein, those in my mind or brain, are derivative of the selfsame fields that comprise you, the book, ink, etc. This is a closed system consisting of the author, which is me, the content, the media, in other words, the paper, computer, etc., by which the information is conveyed, and the reader, you, all of which are epiphenomena or derivative of the same continuous field system, regardless of when or where in the world you're reading this. Given this, one could ask, why not just leave out the middleman? Why is a book even needed? This information was always present within the fields, so why don't I just know all this stuff like the author does? To put it another way, the fields need not have organized themselves into subatomic particles comprising the neurons in my brain, which all fired in such a manner that I ultimately came up with the content of this book. Remember, my brain and its neurons are derivative of the exact same fields that your brain is. Throughout the entire author, content, reader system, the quantum fields are the common denominator permeating the subjective reader, you, the subjective author, me, and the objective media by which this information is being conveyed between us. The media through which this information is transmitted is derivative of the same fields as the source and receiver of the information, whether via electronic screen, by paper, by voice through the air, which is also derivative of, you guessed it, the quantum fields. In other words, we're all inextricably connected by the fields of and through which we and everything in the universe exists. The fields are continuous, they're indivisible, and they are fundamental elements upon which all of reality is built. By the way, I would suggest that all information in the universe is already baked into the field system. But you can see how this information works. I mean, how many times have you been thinking about somebody and then a few minutes later you got a text from them, right? This field system is always working. The old particle model of reality, which operated through the end of the last century, was useful to a great degree. You can see that on the left. But it doesn't explain nearly as much as the new model, which incorporates quantum field theory and consciousness as its basis. And consciousness, or energy with intent, on this material plane of existence, at least, is essentially an energy field unique to each of us. I like to think of it as the ghost in the machine. Others might call it our soul. But the dynamics are all the same, regardless of what we label it. Conscious use of information, whether by us or by divine algorithm, or by an active universal conscious, insert your favorite deity here, appears to be the foundational basis of the world in which we live, including ourselves, our DNA, its atomic structure, etc. Nonetheless, there's no doubt that consciousness is a thing, and we leverage it as clinicians to facilitate cognitive restructuring in our patients, rewiring the neural connections in their brains by virtue of transfer of information, which we'll see working in real time a few slides from now. But just for fun, let's have a quick look at an example of how consciousness, or directed energy with intent, materially impacts our external environment. Remember, information transfer need not only be between our ears or between people or between other sentient beings. Check this out.
Subway exhibit comes to us from Japan and Mr. Masuro Emoto. Mr. Emoto became terribly interested in the molecular structure of water and what affects it. Now, water is the most receptive of the 4 elements. Mr. Emoto thought perhaps it would respond to non-physical events. So he set up a series of studies, applied mental stimuli, and photographed it with a dark field microscope. This first picture is a picture of water from the Fujiwara Dam. And this picture is the same water after receiving a blessing from a Zen Buddhist monk. Now, in this next series of pictures, Mr. Emoto printed out words, taped them to bottles of distilled water, and left them out overnight. This first photograph is a picture of the pure distilled water, just the essence of itself. These subsequent photographs, as you can see, are each different. This is the chi of love. And we move along here to thank you. And you can see where he taped that to this bottle here. But if you read Japanese, you already knew that. Now, Mr. Emoto speaks of the thought or intent being the driving force in all of this. The science of how that actually affects the molecules is unknown, except to the water molecules, of course. And it's really fascinating when you keep in mind that 90% of our bodies are water.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
Fascinating, right? And if you caught it, it's notable that language is irrelevant. The universe doesn't have a favored language, rather it responds to intent and emotion, both of which are universal among all brands of human. Now, let's look at the impact of information transfer in real time in this next video as we see new neural connections being made. it would be easy to look at the following content from the perspective of psychologists, seeing only neurons moving around in real time. But remember, neurons are made up of molecules, which are made up of multiple atoms, which are made of quarks and electrons, which are in turn derivative of the quantum field system, which is ultimately defined by information. So what you're about to witness is direct physical evidence of consciousness-driven field information transfer in action. This is what cognitive restructuring it is. And it also happens to have been occurring the entire time you've been sitting in this presentation, both as the information has been flowing from me to you, but also as your own consciousness has been working out some of the implications for this new information, whether consciously or unconsciously. Let's have a look.
Synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this is what's happening in your brain, geniuses. If you learn one bit of information today, your brain did this. Boom. Boom. That's learning. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment. Every time you learn something in your brain, there's a physical change that takes place, and learning is making new connections. Are you with me? This is how fast it happens, too. That's learning. If you learn anything this week, you've made a footprint. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then if you keep firing the same thoughts over and over again, you're going to wire them in your brain. So then if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. And all of a sudden, they develop a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more you communicate, the more they connect. And neurons are exactly the same way. Now, as you begin to learn information, neurons tend to assemble themselves into networks, or what's called neural networks. And neural networks are just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections that's related to a thought, a skill, a habit, a behavior, a concept. And neural networks are automatic programs. You have a neural network to brush your teeth, to put on makeup, to speak a language, to walk. All of a sudden, those neurons then form a hardware circuitry, but if you keep repeating it, the hardware becomes a software program and it becomes automatic. So then, you want to see a thought? Watch. Boom, there's a thought. Right there. Watch again. Boom, that's a thought. You generate more electrical impulses in your brain in one day than all the cell phones on the planet put together. And it's not coming from the candy bar you just ate. You are connected to a greater field.
All right. So what we have in terms of implications of this cause and effect versus causing an effect, going back to our blaming, our external locus of control problem that our patients often present. When we present this new information to them, it allows us to change their point of view, if you will, from victim to creator, right? Because they have to realize that they're creating their circumstances, not the other way around. Which can decrease their anxiety when they realize that they can have a material impact on their reality. It promotes their ability to think about what they're thinking about, because if we tend to get what we're thinking about, obviously it makes sense to pay attention to that. That becomes a part of the process on a regular basis. We're able to reframe their history. Again, not from the point of view of victim, but realizing that they played an actual role in creating it, and as such, they can feel less victimized about it. It also, of course, instills hope for the future as they develop a vision for what they would like their life to be like, and they can focus their energies on that to help create that reality, or something more closely resembling at the very least. This model helps to connect patients to other people. It creates connection between them and perhaps a higher power, or enhances their connection to a higher power if they already have one, by virtue of the fact that we're literally derivative of the exact same field system as everybody else. You sitting there, me here, we're all literally derivative of the same field system. The science is irrefutable, and this type of model bypasses the writing reflex of people that tend to be skeptical about various, shall we say, religious approaches as opposed to spiritual approaches. You may recall early in the presentation that I believe the most important aspects of the change model, the Dispenza change model, are information and experiences. So let's run through this one more time. Remember, the body doesn't know the difference between a real and imagined experience. And so the more we internalize our patients' understanding of this new information on the nature of reality within them, the greater the impact it's going to be on their thoughts. The application of this new information, the doing part of biofield therapy, takes the form of mental rehearsal and meditation on their unique vision, in which patients occupy a richly defined ideal reality as though it were occurring in the present. The consequent experiences outside of the meditation then tend to reaffirm the effectiveness of this approach as they have a material impact on their environment. On a scale larger than the subway water experiment, the universe consistently responds to their unquestioned beliefs, which have now shifted to that new identity and will continue to do so as their outer world begins to reflect their inner life. Eventually, the patient's identity fully shifts to that of a person with an active sense of spirituality and connection, conditions that are conducive to a strong depth of recovery. Here are some principles derived from science whose clinical application to our patients, will set us apart from our colleagues. And all of these extrapolations are based upon extensive peer-reviewed research of the underlying science. The universe is indifferent, responding to our aspirations. Mixed feelings tend to yield mixed results. I'm not going to go through all these, but you can, they're in a handout I'll provide, or you can just pause the video here if you want to and go back over it. A clinician pondering the implementation of biofield therapy with their patients might say, wow, this is great, but gosh, it would take forever for someone to internalize and begin applying these concepts in their life. But the fact of the matter is that you've all already been applying these concepts to yourself for your entire lives. You just frankly haven't been aware of it. Think about it. For better or for worse, right now your life currently represents the cumulative effects of every thought you've ever had as it manifested into your choices, your behaviors, your emotions, etc. Your entire life as you sit here exemplifies this model. Every conscious or subconscious doubt you've ever had about what's either possible or impossible for you has informed your choices, your behaviors, and your experiences, and your emotions, yielding the life that you have now. And this will continue. You can see how gaining new information and experiences along the way has either worked to your detriment or your benefit as well. But we need not, like our patients, be facing jail time, abandonment of loved ones, or existential despair to realize that our thoughts and unquestioned beliefs have likely limited us or created a gap between where we are and where we intuitively believe we could be in terms of things like our professional advancement, our finances, our relationships, our physical aspirations, or our overall happiness, frankly. I told you at the beginning of this presentation that it's essentially an experiential intervention, but you now have the ability to put this information to the test for yourself and see what happens. This information and 36 hours of corresponding media are available in my book, Resolving Spiritual Skepticism, of which I have some copies here and which are available from Amazon. I offer in-person and remote presentations such as this one for Lunch and Learns, as well as clinical track curriculum for individuals, for facilities, and group practices. I also offer in-person 2 or 3 day workshops with clinical group note templates to treatment facilities that can be done over a weekend if necessary to unburden clinical staff for other opportunities. And I also have a workbook available to facilitate biofield therapy within a group or individual settings, or for individual study for patients on their own. Thank you very much for your time, and I will stick around for questions if you want to reach me. My contact information is above. Again, thank you.